My mother-in-law called me at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning to tell me that the bedroom set I had never agreed to buy cost $4,200, and that she expected the money by Friday. I had stopped by her house the previous Sunday with a casserole my wife Willow had made, spent exactly 40 minutes sitting in their living room, and left with a handshake and a Tupperware container. Somehow, between Sunday afternoon and Tuesday morning, that visit had transformed into a binding financial commitment. But let me start from the beginning, because the beginning is where you understand exactly how a man like me ends up standing in his own kitchen at 9 in the morning, holding a phone to his ear and listening to his mother-in-law quote him furniture prices with the calm authority of someone reading from a legally enforceable contract. My name is Nathan Cole, and for the 3 years of my marriage to Willow Morrison, I had been what her family privately referred to as adequate. Not exceptional. Not impressive. Adequate, in the way that a weather forecast is adequate when you needed sunshine and got clouds. I knew about the designation because Willow's younger sister, Becca, had a genuinely terrible poker face and had once let it slip during a family dinner when she'd had 2 glasses of wine and thought I was out of earshot. "He's fine, Mom. He's adequate." I'd been carrying that word around in my back pocket ever since, turning it over like a coin I wasn't sure was real currency or just a very convincing fake. I worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized investment firm. I was good at my job, careful with money, genuinely reliable. I made a solid living, not spectacular, but solid. I loved my wife, or at least I had loved who I thought she was when I married her. I was also, and this is important, the only person in the Morrison household circle who apparently did not understand that loving your wife meant loving her mother's furniture budget. Willow's mother, Diana Chen, was a woman of exquisite and expensive taste who treated financial conversations the way other people treat weather, as an ambient condition of life that simply existed, not something anyone had caused or was responsible for. She had the bone structure of a woman who had been beautiful her whole life and knew it, and she deployed that beauty with the efficiency of someone who had learned very early that it was her most reliable asset. She was not cruel exactly. She was something more specific than cruel. She was completely, comprehensively unconcerned with anyone else's financial reality. When she wanted something, she described it to Willow. Willow agreed that it was a reasonable desire, and then somehow, through a process I still don't entirely understand, the wanting and the agreeing became Nathan's responsibility to fund. It had happened with the new kitchen appliances 18 months into our marriage. It had happened with the vacation to Scottsdale that Diana and her friend Linda had taken, which Willow and I had helped with to the tune of $800. It had happened, in smaller increments, roughly 14 times in 3 years. And now it was happening with a bedroom set. The Tuesday morning call went like this. Diana's voice was warm, almost cheerful, the way it always was when she was about to say something expensive. "Nathan, sweetheart," she said, and the sweetheart landed with the specificity of a woman who knew it would soften me. "I've been thinking about the bedroom. After your visit on Sunday, I kept looking at that furniture and it's just so old, Nathan. It's embarrassing, honestly. For your wife to come visit her mother and see furniture like that." I was already in my car, about to leave for work, and I sat there in the driveway holding the phone slightly away from my ear. "The set I found is $4,200, she continued. "Very reasonable. Italian frame, the headboard is upholstered, it's beautiful. I can send you the link." There was a pause. "I figured since you and Willow were so kind to visit Sunday, we dropped off a casserole," I said. There was another pause, shorter this time. "Of course," Diana said. "And that was so thoughtful. But you know how much it means to me to have family around. The bedroom just feels so, Nathan, it's important for a woman my age to have a proper space. You understand." I told her I would talk to Willow. She said wonderful, that she'd send the link, and then she said goodbye with the cheerful finality of a woman who considered the matter settled. I sat in my driveway for another 2 minutes after we hung up. The engine was running. The garage door was still open behind me. My coffee was in the cup holder getting cold, and I looked at it and thought, 40 minutes. I spent 40 minutes in that house. I ate 2 cookies from the plate she put out. I complimented the curtains. I heard about her friend Linda's hip surgery. 40 minutes and apparently it cost $105 a minute. I backed out of the driveway and went to work and spent the drive thinking about the number 4,200 and what it would look like in my bank account, and then I spent the day thinking about Willow and what the conversation would sound like, and whether I still had any reliable way of predicting how Willow's conversations went. Because here is the thing about Willow that took me almost the full 3 years to articulate clearly, even to myself. She was not dishonest. She was not mean. She was genuinely, architecturally incapable of disappointing her mother. It was not a choice she made, it was something more structural than that, like a load-bearing wall you couldn't remove without the whole house shifting. When Diana wanted something, Willow's first response was always emotional. She felt the wanting as her own wanting, absorbed it like a sponge, and then turned to me with the expression of a woman who is not asking so much as noticing together that a thing needs to happen. We'd had arguments about this. Calm arguments, loud arguments, one very memorable argument in the parking garage of a mall that had ended with both of us staring at the concrete wall in silence for 3 minutes before getting in the car. Nothing changed. Diana wanted, Willow felt, Nathan paid. This was the system, and I was the only one who seemed to find it remarkable. The conversation that evening was exactly what I had predicted during my drive home, which was its own kind of exhausting. Willow was already home when I got there, standing in the kitchen with a glass of white wine and the particular posture she adopted when she already knew what the conversation was going to be about. She'd heard from Diana. Of course she had. She found a really beautiful set, Willow said, before I'd even taken off my jacket. Italian frame. The photos are gorgeous. I put my bag down and looked at her. She was objectively beautiful, my wife. Dark hair, good cheekbones, the kind of effortless elegance that made people look twice in restaurants. She was also, in this moment, completely unreachable on the subject of Diana's furniture, and we both knew it. $4,200, I said. Because we stopped by on Sunday. Willow's expression shifted into what I mentally called the mediation face, not defensive, exactly, but carefully positioned between her mother's desire and my resistance, like a diplomat who has taken a chair at the exact midpoint of a negotiating table. She's been talking about that bedroom for months, Willow said. The furniture is genuinely old, Nathan. It's falling apart. When did I agree to this? I said. The mediation face held steady. You didn't, she said. But it would mean so much to her. 4 words. But it would mean so much to her. I had heard those 8 syllables approximately 40 times in 3 years, deployed in service of kitchen appliances and vacations and a garden feature Diana had seen in a magazine and a birthday dinner that had ended up costing more than our first anniversary trip. I had responded to those words with patience, with negotiation, with occasional frustration, with the occasional quiet calculation of what we could actually afford and what that meant for our own lives. None of those responses had ever materially changed the outcome. I said I needed to think about it. Willow said, of course, take your time, in a tone that suggested the deadline was Friday. I said nothing. She refilled her wine. We had pasta for dinner and talked about her day at work, and the number 4,200 sat between us on the table like a centerpiece neither of us acknowledged. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay next to Willow in the dark, listening to her breathe with the easy regularity of someone whose conscience was entirely clear, and I ran numbers in my head. Not the furniture numbers. Different numbers. Numbers I had been quietly, carefully running for about 5 months, the ones I kept in a private. Not done with Willow, exactly. Not yet. But done with the system. Done with being adequate in someone else's assessment of my value. Done with 40-minute casserole visits that somehow cost $4,000. I got up at 5 a.m. and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the early dark with my laptop, and I went through my spreadsheet for the last time, and then I closed it and called my friend Marcus. Marcus Webb had been my closest friend since college, where we'd bonded over our shared conviction that financial modeling was underrated as a life skill and that anyone who disagreed had simply never been broke at the right moment. He was now a CPA with his own small firm, and the only person in my life, outside of work, who knew what I had been building for the past 5 months. He picked up on the second ring despite the hour, which was one of many reasons I valued him. "She want money again," he said, instead of hello. 4,200, I said. "Bedroom furniture." There was a pause on Marcus's end that contained a great deal of unsaid commentary. "And the visit," he said. "Casserole drop-off." 40 minutes. "Nathan," Marcus said, with the specific tone of a man who has been waiting for this conversation for quite some time. "I think you already know what I'm going to say." "I'm ready," I said. "I know." There was another pause, and then Marcus said, "Okay. Let's talk." We talked for an hour. I won't give you all of it. The details are complicated and specific and involve a certain amount of regulatory framework that does not make for compelling listening, but the short version is this: 5 months earlier, I had identified an opportunity through my work that was available to me personally, entirely legitimately, that had the potential to significantly change my financial position in a way that nobody watching my regular salary would anticipate. I had taken that opportunity. Carefully, precisely, over 5 months, following every applicable rule because I am constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. And it had worked better than I'd projected. Considerably better. Marcus knew, because Marcus had helped me structure it correctly. Nobody else knew. Not Willow. Not Diana. Not the version of Nathan that Diana considered adequate. When I hung up the phone, it was just after 6 a.m. and the kitchen was still dark outside the window, and I sat there with my second coffee and something I had not felt in quite a while, the specific, quiet steadiness of a man who knows exactly where he stands. I texted Willow that morning before she woke up. I said, "I've thought about the furniture. We should all have dinner Thursday. You, me, your mom. My treat. I can explain what I've decided." She texted back 12 minutes later. She'd been awake. She always woke up at 6:30, with, "Really? That's great, Nathan. She'll be so happy." She added a heart emoji. I put my phone face down on the counter and finished my coffee. Let me tell you about Willow and how we got here, because I don't want you to think this is a simple story. Simple stories are for people who haven't been paying attention. I met Willow at a corporate event 4 years ago, one of those industry mixers where everyone stands around holding drinks they've barely touched and talking about things they don't entirely care about. She had walked into the room wearing a dark green dress and immediately located the one person in the crowd who was genuinely engaged in his conversation rather than performing engagement, and she had gone to stand next to him. That person was me. I was talking to a colleague about infrastructure investment, which is not a seductive topic, but I was talking about it with real enthusiasm, and Willow later told me that was why she'd come over. "You actually cared about what you were saying," she said. Everyone else in the room was just talking. We had talked for 2 hours at that event and then continued talking over dinner, and the talking was easy in the way that talking sometimes is with a person who is genuinely intelligent and genuinely interested, and I was, in the specific vocabulary of that time, completely gone for her within 3 weeks. She was smart, she was funny in the dry way I liked, she had opinions about things and defended them clearly. She also loved her mother with an intensity that I found, at first, genuinely moving. Here was a woman with a strong family bond. Here was loyalty. Here was devotion. I know. I know exactly how naive that sounds in retrospect. But I was in love, and love has a particular way of reframing data. The family bond revealed its financial dimension about 6 months into our relationship, which was 2 months before we got engaged, which means I had the information and still made the choice. I'm not exonerating myself. I saw it and I thought, I can work with this. I am a reasonable man. I can have reasonable conversations. Families are complicated. Love means accepting complicated things. What I failed to adequately account for was that reasonable conversations with Diana Chen were not actually possible, because Diana Chen operated from the premise that money was a topic that existed in a different category than decision-making. Money simply appeared when it was needed, ideally without anyone having to have an awkward conversation about it, and the source of the money was Nathan, and Nathan was adequate, and adequate people didn't make a fuss. I hadn't fully understood this until year 2 of the marriage, when I had tried to have what I thought was a very reasonable conversation about establishing a budget for family contributions, and Diana had listened to me with a politely blank expression and then turned to Willow and asked if she'd seen the new place on Birch Street, and that was the end of that conversation. Thursday evening. I had made a reservation at Cavallo, which was the restaurant in our neighborhood that Diana considered appropriate for important dinners. It was not cheap. It was also not $4,200 for a bedroom set, so I considered it a reasonable venue. I arrived first, which I always did, and sat with a glass of water and watched the door. Diana arrived wearing a cream-colored blazer and the expression of a woman coming to collect something she'd already mentally spent. She kissed my cheek and said, "Nathan, sweetheart," and sat down across from me, and her eyes moved to the menu the way a hawk's eyes move to a field. Willow arrived 3 minutes later, slightly flushed from parking, and took the seat between us, and we ordered drinks, and Diana talked about Linda's hip, and Willow talked about a project at her design firm, and I listened and ate my bread and waited for the moment when it would be right to say what I'd come to say. The moment arrived naturally, between the appetizers and the main course, when Diana set down her fork with the gentle deliberateness of a woman who has been patient long enough. "Nathan," she said, "I'm so glad you suggested this dinner. Have you had a chance to look at the set I sent?" I had. I had looked at it 3 times, in fact, the way you look at something that represents a decision rather than a purchase. It was a beautiful set. Italian frame, upholstered headboard and a warm ivory, solid walnut legs, the kind of furniture that would last 20 years if you treated it right. $4,200, which was, depending on how you looked at it, either a lot of money for a bedroom set or a very small amount of money compared to several other figures I had been thinking about this week. "I did look at it," I said. Diana folded her hands on the table with the pleased composure of a woman hearing the first note of a familiar song. "I'm not going to pay for it," I said. The familiar song stopped. Across the table, Willow's hand moved toward her water glass and then stopped mid-reach. Diana's expression didn't change immediately, she had too much self-possession for that, but something behind her eyes shifted, recalculating. "I see," she said, in the measured tone of a woman deciding which approach to take. "I want to explain why," I said. "And I want to do it here, because I think this is a conversation we should all have together. And I think a restaurant is actually a good place for it because everyone stays calm in restaurants." Willow said, quietly, "Nathan." I looked at her. She had the expression I'd been braced for, not angry, not yet, but the look of a woman who feels a structure she depends on beginning to move under her feet. "Let me finish," I said, very gently. "I'm not angry. I'm not trying to cause a scene. I just want to be honest with all of you." There was a pause. The ambient noise of the restaurant, silverware, low conversation, someone laughing 2 tables over, continued without us. Diana said, "I'm listening." I had prepared what I was going to say, in the way I prepared anything important, which is to say carefully and with an awareness of the possible responses and how I would handle each of them. I told Diana, in a level and entirely pleasant tone, that I valued her, that I was glad she was in our lives, and that I had spent 3 years trying to demonstrate that by contributing to things that mattered to her. I named some of them. The kitchen appliances. The Scottsdale trip. The garden feature. The birthday dinner. I named the amounts. I did this without any drama, in the same voice I used to present quarterly analysis at work, which is to say the voice of a person who has done the math and is now reporting it. The numbers, laid out in sequence, came to approximately $19,400 over 3 years, not counting smaller contributions I hadn't tracked as carefully at the beginning of the marriage. Diana's expression during this recitation was very still. Willow had set down her fork. "I'm not asking for any of that back," I said. "That money was given willingly, even if the asking was sometimes uncomfortable. What I'm saying is that I've reached a point where I've thought carefully about what I can do for our family, yours and Willow's and mine, and what I cannot do." The bedroom set is in the cannot column. Not because $4,000 is beyond our means, but because the pattern it represents is something I can't keep participating in. Diana said, "Pattern." She said it the way you repeat a word in a foreign language that you're not sure you've understood correctly. "A visit on Sunday does not create a financial obligation," I said. 40 minutes and a casserole is a loving act. It's not a transaction. The silence at the table lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a restaurant. Then Diana said, "I didn't say it was a transaction." "No," I said. "You called it a bedroom set and quoted me a price." Willow said, "Nathan, I love you," I said to Willow, and I meant it, fully and without performance. "I want to have this conversation because I want things to be different. I'm not leaving. I'm not angry. I'm being honest with you, finally, which I should have been a long time ago." Diana recovered first, because Diana always recovered first. She picked up her fork, took a small deliberate bite of her appetizer, and when she set it down again her face had reorganized itself into a kind of dignified hurt that I recognized as her most effective setting. "I never meant to be a burden," she said, and her voice had the careful waver of genuine emotion imperfectly controlled. "I thought we were family, Nathan. Family helps each other." There it was. Family helps each other. The phrase that had functioned, for 3 years, as the financial philosophy of the Chin Morrison household. I looked at it, in this context, and I felt something settle further into place inside me. "Family does help each other," I said. And I have. Genuinely and gladly, most of the time. What family doesn't do is present bills. And I think, if we're being honest, that's what's been happening. Diana looked at Willow. It was the look of a woman who expects her daughter to intervene, to smooth, to mediate. Willow was looking at her water glass. "Willow," Diana said. And Willow looked up, and for a moment, a very brief, very specific moment, she looked at me first. Not at her mother. At me. And her expression was something I hadn't seen in a long time, something that might have been the beginning of recognition. Then she looked at Diana and said, "Mom, let Nathan finish." In 3 years of marriage, Willow had never, not once, said those words in that sequence. Let Nathan finish. I sat with that for a second, then I continued. I said that going forward, I was happy to be part of a family that supported each other, but that support needed to be mutual and explicit and agreed upon, not assumed and assigned. I said that Willow and I needed to have our own conversations about our household budget before any family contributions were made, and that those conversations needed to happen first, not after the price tag had already been communicated. I said this without drama and without apology. Diana absorbed it with the expression of a woman taking careful inventory. When I finished, she said, with a lightness that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Well, this has been a very interesting dinner." And then she asked the waiter for the dessert menu, because Diana never let a moment be the last word if she could help it. But something had shifted. I could feel it in the quality of the silence between us, the way it had a different texture than before. Not hostile. Not resolved. Something new. Something that didn't have a name yet. Willow didn't say much in the car on the way home. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the dark road, and I drove, and the radio was off, and the quiet was the kind that isn't absence but presence. When we got home she went upstairs and I stayed in the kitchen for a while, and then I heard her come back down, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with an expression I didn't entirely know how to read. $19,400, she said. That's what you've been sitting on. I wasn't sitting on it to deploy it, I said. I just knew. She nodded slowly. I didn't know it added up to that, she said. And then, after a pause, I'm sorry. 2 words. Quiet, unperformed, just placed in the air between us. I looked at her, and the love I'd had for this woman, which had been bending under weight for a long time, did something complicated in my chest. I know, I said. I know you are. She came and sat at the kitchen table and we stayed there for an hour, talking in a way we hadn't talked in a year, maybe more, the way we'd talked at that industry mixer when she'd walked over because I was being real about something. The furniture was not mentioned again that night. But Diana was not finished. Diana was never finished on the first night. I want to be clear about this, I did not underestimate her. I had lived in her orbit for 3 years and I knew the playbook, which was extensive, and I knew that what had happened at Cavallo was not a conclusion but a first move in a longer game. She called Willow the next morning, I know because I heard Willow's half of the conversation from the bedroom, and the call lasted 45 minutes, and when it was done Willow came to find me in the home office where I was working and stood in the doorway with the careful expression of someone who is genuinely trying to navigate something complicated. She's really hurt, Willow said. She says you humiliated her. I had a calm dinner conversation, I said. I didn't raise my voice once. I know, Willow said. I told her that. What did she say? She said calm doesn't mean kind. I looked at Willow. Is she right? Willow looked at me for a long moment. No, she said, finally. No, I think you were kind, Nathan. I think you were honest. I need you to understand that this is going to be complicated for a while, with her. I know, I said. I expected that. Willow nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, what was the thing Marcus was helping you with? The thing you mentioned to him Tuesday morning? I heard you on the phone. I looked at her. She said, I wasn't eavesdropping. I was in the hallway and I heard you say his name. It's something I've been working on, I said. Something financial. For how long? 5 months. She absorbed this. Are we okay? And I heard the real question inside the question, the one that wasn't about money. We're going to be, I said, and I meant it in more ways than one. What happened next came in 3 separate waves, and I'll tell you all of them because each one mattered. The first wave was Diana. 2 days after the dinner, she called me directly, not Willow, me, and she was entirely different on the phone than she'd been at Cavallo. The warm sweetness was gone. What replaced it was something cooler and more precise, the voice of a woman who had decided that soft management had failed and was now trying something else. Nathan, she said. I want to have an honest conversation with you. I'd like that, I said. I've been thinking, she said, about the kind of marriage I raised Willow to expect. And I've been thinking about whether you're the right man to give her that. I kept my voice completely level. What kind of marriage did you raise her to expect? I said. A partnership, Diana said, and the word landed with its full intended weight. A marriage where both partners take care of each other's families. Where a man supports his wife's family, especially when that family is her mother, alone, who has given everything for her daughter. I let her finish. Then I said, Diana, Willow's father left money in an investment account when he passed. I know, because Willow showed me the estate documents when we got married. The account currently holds approximately $340,000. I've never mentioned it to you because it was Willow's business to share with you or not. But it's there, and Willow is not, by any reasonable measure, without resources. The silence on the other end of the line was the longest silence Diana had ever maintained in my presence. When she spoke again, her voice had a different quality. That account is for Willow's future, she said, after a moment. Not for furniture, I said pleasantly. Another pause. Nathan, she said, and the warmth came back, warmer than before, the dial turned up, a full production of warmth. I think we started off on the wrong foot the other night. I think what I should have said is, the bedroom set was never a demand. It was a hope. I thought, as family, I should have asked differently. Yes, I said. You should have. A beat. Well, she said. Perhaps we can find another time to talk. Perhaps, I said. Goodbye, Diana. And I hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, and I was aware that something had shifted in the dynamic that had governed my life for 3 years, and the shift was permanent. You cannot unring a bell. You cannot undo the moment when someone realizes that the leverage they had was not as substantial as they believed. The second wave was something I hadn't expected. It arrived in the form of a man named Joseph Ashworth, who was Willow's colleague at the design firm where she worked, and who had been, I would come to understand, a somewhat more significant presence in her life over the past year than she had communicated to me. I had known Joseph existed. He was mentioned occasionally at dinner, Joseph's take on the presentation, Joseph's contact at the architecture firm, the way you mention someone who is a regular feature of your work life. I had not met him. I had had no reason to think about him. The reason I started thinking about him was a text message that I saw entirely by accident, on a Thursday evening when Willow had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to answer the door for a package delivery, and it buzzed with a message from Joseph and the screen lit up and the preview was, "Think he knows? Or does he think this is all still just work talk?" Face with tears of joy, and then Willow came back from the door and picked up the phone and the screen went dark and she looked at me with the normal, unguarded expression of someone who doesn't know their phone has just made a statement, and I looked back at her with the normal expression of a man who has just had his entire internal framework rearranged in approximately 4 seconds. I didn't say anything. This was a deliberate choice. A reactive choice made in the moment, but deliberate. I had no information, only a fragment, and fragments are not evidence of anything except their own incompleteness. What I knew was this: there was a Joseph. Joseph apparently found something about Nathan amusing. And the something in question concerned whether Nathan knew. What did I know? Or what did I not know? I let the evening continue normally. We had dinner. I made pasta, Willow set the table. We talked about her project, a residential renovation with a client who kept changing her mind about the kitchen. I listened. I watched her hands while she talked, the way she held her fork, the way she tilted her head when she was making a point. She was not acting strangely. She was exactly as she always was. Which was, itself, a kind of information. I called Marcus again the next morning from my car, parked in the office garage, before I went upstairs. I told him what I'd seen on the phone. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You want to know what I've actually been sitting on for 2 months?" I said, "Yes." "Willow has dinner with Joseph Ashworth roughly once a week," Marcus said. "Thursdays. The restaurant near her firm." I know because Riley was his girlfriend, who also worked in the area. Riley saw them there twice. She mentioned it to me. I didn't know what to do with it, Nathan. Maybe it's work. Probably it's work. But with everything else you've been telling me, I thought you should know. I sat in the parking garage and looked at the concrete pillar in front of my car. My hands were on the steering wheel. I am not a dramatic person. I do not tend toward grand emotional gestures. But I sat in that parking garage for a full 5 minutes doing nothing, which for me constitutes a significant response. Then I went upstairs and did 8 hours of precise, focused financial analysis, because work is where I have always known exactly where I stand. The thing about discovering a potential infidelity, or a potential something, because I still had only a fragment and a friend's observation, is that it reorganizes how you see every recent memory. I did this reorganization over the following 3 days, quietly and methodically, the way I would do any kind of audit. I was not trying to confirm a conclusion. I was trying to understand what was true. I replayed conversations, timing, the occasional Thursday evening when Willow had come home slightly later than expected and had been in a particular mood, not guilty, exactly, more the mood of someone who has had a good evening and is mildly guilty about feeling good. I thought about the last year of our marriage, the way the connection between us had been thinning, not breaking but thinning, like a piece of fabric worn down in a specific spot. I had attributed this to the general stress of the Diana situation, to the weight of the financial pattern, to the fatigue of 3 years of managed compromise. I had not thought to look elsewhere. I was now looking. I want to be precise about what I found, because precision matters to me and because I am not interested in being a narrator who exaggerates for effect. I found evidence of a friendship that had been conducted with more intimacy and more secrecy than friendship typically requires. I found, specifically, a dinner receipt that came through our shared Apple Pay account. Willow had forgotten to switch payment methods for a Thursday evening when she had told me she was working late. The restaurant was not near her firm. It was a nicer restaurant, the kind you go to when the occasion feels like occasion. The charge was for two. I looked at the receipt for a very long time. Then I called Patricia Sohn, who was my lawyer for the business matters I'd been handling for 5 months, and I told her I needed to add a personal item to our agenda. She said she could see me Monday morning. I said Monday morning was fine. What Patricia confirmed, when I sat across from her on Monday morning and outlined the situation with the precision I bring to everything, was that the steps I should take were both legal and financial and that I should take them in a specific order and with specific documentation, and that if I was correct about what I suspected, there were several implications for the financial arrangements that I would want to address sooner rather than later. I won't give you the full legal consultation because Patricia bills $380 an hour and honestly earns it, but the summary is, document, do not confront yet, protect your assets, and be absolutely certain before you do anything irreversible. I said I understood. I asked her how long people usually wait. She said, depends on the person. Some people can't wait. Some people need to be sure. You seem like someone who needs to be sure. I said she was right about that. She said, then take the time you need. But not too long. Time has a way of being expensive. I thanked her and went back to my car and sat in it for less than a minute this time, which I took as progress. It took me 9 more days. And then I was sure. I'm not going to detail every step of those 9 days, partly because some of it is private and partly because the details are less important than what they added up to. What I will tell you is that on a Thursday evening, at a restaurant that was not near Willow's firm, I sat at a table in a corner with a view of the entrance, and I watched my wife walk in with Joseph Ashworth, and I watched the way they sat together, and I watched the body language of two people who are not having a work dinner, and I had the specific, airless experience of being certain about something you have been hoping to be wrong about. Joseph Ashworth was, physically, everything I was not: taller, broader, the kind of looks that read as effortless in the way expensive watches read as effortless. He had a large, expressive laugh that I could see from across the restaurant. Willow was laughing too. She looked comfortable in a way that sat in my chest with the cold weight of a stone dropped in still water. I did not approach them. I paid for my coffee and I left and I walked to my car and I drove home and I sat in our house, which was quiet and empty, and I made a decision. Not the emotional decision. The emotional part of me had been making its decision slowly for 9 days, the way concrete slowly sets. The decision I made in the quiet house was the practical one, and it was this: I was going to give Willow the chance to be honest with me before I made any irreversible moves, because she had said I was kind when I confronted Diana at dinner, and I wanted to continue to be kind, even now, even here, because that is who I am and I was not going to let this situation change that. I texted her, come home when you're done tonight. I'd like to talk. She texted back 20 minutes later, of course, on my way. And she came home. She was wearing a light blue dress I hadn't seen before. She came in through the front door and stopped when she saw me sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and nothing else, and something in my stillness communicated itself to her because her expression changed before I said a word. Nathan, she said. Just my name. Sit down, I said. She sat. I looked at her for a moment and then I said, tell me about Joseph. And she did. It was not what I had thought, exactly. It was not entirely different either. It was, as most honest confessions are, more complicated than the version I'd constructed in my head during 9 days of careful observation. She and Joseph had been close for about 14 months. It had, she said, stayed within a boundary, no physical affair, but she admitted immediately and without prompting that she had been emotionally present with him in a way she had not been with me, that she had told him things she hadn't told me, that Thursday dinners had been a form of escape from what she described, quietly and with what appeared to be genuine remorse, as the life I'd built but couldn't quite live in anymore. I listened to all of it. I did not interrupt. When she finished, the silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight. Then I said, "The life you couldn't live in, which part?" She looked down at the table. "I knew you weren't happy," she said. "With my mom. With how things were. I just kept thinking it would get better, or we'd figure it out, and instead of figuring it out I went somewhere where nobody needed me to figure it out." I said, "Did you love him?" She looked up at me. "No," she said. "I don't think so." "Not the way," she stopped. "Not the way I love you," she said. "Do you love me?" I said. She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, and her voice was the voice of someone telling the truth at significant personal cost. "Even though?" "Especially because," she said. "You sat across from my mother and told her the truth and you were kind doing it, and her voice broke, just slightly, just enough to be real. I have not been kind to you. I have let things happen to you that I should have stopped." We sat in the kitchen for a long time. The food in the refrigerator went unmade. The night settled in around the house. I will not tell you that it was resolved, because it wasn't, not that night. But I will tell you that it was real. Finally, after 3 years of managed surfaces, it was real. It was during this period, the strange, suspended period after Willow's confession when we were existing in the house together in a state of provisional honesty, feeling our way forward with the careful slowness of people who have discovered the floor has different properties than they thought, that the third wave arrived. And this one came from a direction I had not expected at all. It came from Becca. Willow's sister, Becca, who had a terrible poker face and once called me adequate with 2 glasses of wine, showed up at our door on a Saturday morning with a coffee she hadn't stopped to put a lid on properly, still slightly out of breath from the drive over, and said, "Nathan, I need to talk to you. About my mother. About what she's been doing. Not just with you." She looked past me into the house. "Is Willow here?" I said she was upstairs. "Can we talk alone first?" she said. Her voice had the slightly wild quality of someone who has finally made a decision they've been sitting on for a long time. I stood back from the door. "Come in," I said. "I'll make more coffee." Becca sat at the kitchen table. I was beginning to understand that my kitchen table was the site of all important conversations, a fact I found both comforting and slightly absurd, and she wrapped both hands around her mug and she told me something that rearranged the shape of the past 3 years yet again. Diana had a separate arrangement. Not with Nathan and Willow specifically, but a pattern that predated their marriage and had run through Becca's previous relationship too, through her boyfriend before this one, through, Becca suspected, the very early years of her own marriage that she knew only through fragments. Diana's second husband, the man who had come after the girl's father, who had been in the picture when Becca was 12 and Willow was 15 and then not in the picture when Becca was 16, had left not because of incompatibility but because, Becca had recently learned, Diana had methodically borrowed money from him in small amounts and occasionally not small amounts, over a period of 2 years, and when the total had reached approximately $60,000, he had realized what was happening and left. Becca had found this out 3 months ago, from the man himself, who she'd run into at a mutual friend's birthday party, who had eventually told her the number over 2 glasses of scotch with the exhausted directness of someone releasing something they'd carried too long. "She's been doing this her whole life," Becca said. "And she picks people who love Willow too much to look at it directly." I sat across from her. "How much did I give her?" I said. "I calculated it," Becca said. "Based on what Willow's told me, over time, in pieces. Around 20,000. 19,400, I said. She blinked. "You counted." "I'm a financial analyst," I said. "It's what I do." She looked at me with an expression that was part guilt and part something like relief. I should have told you earlier, she said. I should have said something. But she's my mother, Nathan. She stopped. Her eyes were red at the corners. I know, I said. I know exactly what she is and how hard that is. Becca put her face in her hands briefly, and then she took them away and sat up straight. What are you going to do? She said. I'm going to talk to Willow, I said. And then I'm going to have a conversation with your mother. Together? No, I said. I'll see Diana alone. I told Willow that afternoon. I sat with her in the living room and I laid it out, the history Becca had shared, the second husband, the $60,000, the pattern. Willow listened without interrupting, which was not characteristic of her, and her face went through several things as I talked, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment and then she said, I knew some of this. Not the number. Not the second husband specifically. But I think I always knew something was wrong with how she handled money and I just never wanted to look at it. She looked at me. She has a problem, Willow said. An actual problem. Not just selfishness. An actual pattern. Yes, I said. I think that's right. What do I do with that? Willow said, and the question had a rawness to it that made it clear she wasn't asking me for an answer, just giving the question somewhere to exist. You don't have to figure it out today, I said. But eventually you do have to look at it. Not for my sake. For yours. She nodded, slowly. And the money, she said. The 20,000. 19.4, I said, automatically. She almost smiled. Nathan, she said. What do you actually want? I thought about it honestly. I want a marriage that's real, I said. I want us to figure out what that is, from the beginning, without Diana's financial reality being part of the architecture. And I stopped. I want you to choose me. Not because it's easier or because I pay for things. Because you actually choose me. Willow was quiet for a long moment. And then she said, I do. Choose you. I want to do it better. Okay, I said. Okay. And something that had been held very tight in my chest for a very long time released a small amount of its grip. The conversation with Diana happened the following Wednesday. I called her and asked to meet, just the two of us, at a coffee shop near her house, and she agreed with the careful enthusiasm of a woman who is trying to recalibrate after a strategic setback. She arrived in a coral blouse, looking well, looking warm, looking like she had her approach fully prepared. I let her settle in, let her order her coffee, let her ask about Willow with the particular tenderness she deployed when she wanted to establish emotional ground. Then I put an envelope on the table between us. She looked at it. What's this? She said. It's a letter, I said. Outlining the contributions I've made to your household over the past 3 years, and the request that they be returned over a structured schedule. It's also an outline of the arrangement I'm proposing going forward. She looked at the envelope and then at me. I spoke with Becca, I said. And with Willow. I also spoke with Gerald Whitmore. I watched her face when I said the name. Gerald Whitmore was the second husband. The recognition that moved across Diana's expression was very brief, very small, and very complete. Gerald and I discussed his experience at some length, I said. He was very forthcoming. Diana's hand around her coffee cup was very still. Nathan, she said, and her voice had the quality of a conversation starting over from a new position. I see that you've done a great deal of thinking about this. I have, I said. I want to be clear that I'm not here to make threats or to cause pain. I'm here because Willow and I are going to continue being married, and you are her mother, and I want the three of us to have a sustainable relationship. For that to happen, things need to change. I gestured to the envelope. Everything I'm proposing is fair. The repayment schedule is manageable. I'm not asking for anything you don't have. And in exchange, we start over, properly, as a family. Diana looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee and took a sip and set it down and looked out the window at the street. The silence lasted long enough to be a conversation of its own. "I'm not a bad person," she said, finally. The words came out quieter than everything else she'd said, and I think, in that moment, they were true. "I know," I said. "I don't think you are. I think you've spent your life managing resources with whatever tools you had available, and some of those tools hurt people who cared about you. I think that's real, and I think you probably know it too." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen from Diana, which was the expression of a woman who has been seen accurately and is not entirely sure whether to be relieved or devastated. "Willow loves you," I said. "That's not changing. I touched the edge of the envelope, this is just us being honest." Finally. She picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands without opening it. "I'll have someone look at this," she said. "Of course," I said. We finished our coffee. She thanked me for meeting her. I thanked her for coming. We stood outside the coffee shop for a moment in the thin autumn sunlight, and Diana said, "You're more than adequate, Nathan. You always were. I just didn't want to give you the credit." I looked at her. "Becca told me," Diana said, with a small, tired smile, "that I called you that. Adequate. She told me you heard." "She has a bad poker face," I said. "She takes after her father," Diana said. And just for a moment, she looked like someone's mother who had once been young and had made decisions she couldn't unmake, and I felt something for her that wasn't exactly compassion but was adjacent to it. Then she said goodbye and walked to her car, and I stood on the sidewalk with my hands in my pockets and looked at the sky for a moment before walking to mine. Now, I promised I would tell you about Marcus and the thing I'd been building for 5 months, because it's relevant, and because stories about financial planning are only boring if you don't understand what they change. Here is what I had done. 5 months before Diana called me about the bedroom set, I had identified through my work an opportunity to make a significant personal investment in a fund that had the characteristics I was specifically looking for, at a point in its structure where private access was possible for qualified investors. I am a qualified investor. The opportunity was legitimate, legal, structured, and exactly the kind of thing that requires technical knowledge to evaluate properly, which is why most people who could have accessed it did not. Marcus had helped me with the tax structure. I had invested a significant portion of my liquid savings. 5 months later, when I was sitting at my kitchen table at 5 a.m. deciding that I was done with the system, the investment had returned enough to change what I could realistically say about my financial future. Not lottery numbers. Not a fantasy. But enough to make the $4,200 bedroom set feel less like a wound and more like, frankly, a punchline. When Patricia finished helping me with the personal matters, she'd also confirmed what I already knew, that the investment structure meant Willow and I needed to have a real financial conversation about our future, a real one, the kind we'd never had because the Diana dynamic had consumed all the air in the room. Willow and I had that conversation on a Saturday morning, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table that had seen so much, with coffee and a bowl of fruit between us and the windows letting in autumn light, and it was the most adult conversation we had ever had, about money and the future and what we actually wanted and what we were willing to do for each other. It lasted 2 hours. Nobody cried. Nobody mediated. It was just us. It was the best conversation of our marriage. The bedroom set, for what it's worth, Diana eventually bought herself. She had resources, as it turned out, when required to look for them. She and Willow negotiated it together, actually negotiated, with Willow as a participant rather than a relay system, and Diana bought a slightly less expensive version that was still beautiful, and when Willow told me about it she looked slightly surprised by how normal it had been, how the conversation had not collapsed under its own weight, how Diana had accepted the parameters without scenes. "She seems different," Willow said, one evening in November, sitting on the couch with her legs folded under her. "Calmer. Like something relaxed." "People can," I said. "When they're not managing anymore." Willow was quiet for a moment. I brought her oranges from the farmer's market yesterday, she said. When I stopped by, she made tea and we just sat and talked. About nothing important. I looked at her. Was it nice? I said. Yeah, she said. It actually was. And the thing I saw on her face was not relief, exactly, but something quieter and more durable, the expression of someone who has found their way to a version of love that is simpler than what they had before and therefore lasts. Joseph Ashworth, in the weeks after Willow's confession, faded from the picture with the self-preserving instincts of a man who had recognized the table had turned. He stopped texting. He transferred to a different project at the firm. Willow told me, matter-of-factly, that she'd had a conversation with him where she'd made clear that Thursday dinners were done, and that she didn't elaborate on her reasons and he didn't press. He had the decency, or possibly the strategic intelligence, to not create additional problems, and I allowed him the space to make that choice. Whether he was a good man or not, I genuinely did not know, and it was not something I needed to resolve. He was a chapter that had closed. Life, I've found, is mostly about which chapters you decide are important enough to keep carrying. I hired a new cleaner in December. Her name is Ana Correa, and she came recommended by the couple who lived 2 doors down. She was cheerful, professional, meticulous about the kitchen, and during her second visit she accidentally broke a small terracotta pot that Willow had kept on the windowsill for years, and she was so completely genuinely mortified, standing in the kitchen with pot shards in her hand, apologizing with the fullness of someone who understood that the object might have mattered even if it looked ordinary, that Willow came in from the other room and immediately said, "Please, it was just a pot." "It's fine," and the two of them spent 20 minutes on the kitchen floor picking up pieces and talking about terracotta in a way that I observed from the doorway with the specific warmth of watching people be human. Anna started calling Willow by her first name after that, and Willow started making extra coffee when she came, and it was a small thing, but small things, I've come to believe, are the actual texture of a life. I noticed, without making a particular deal of it, that Nathan's household had started to feel like somewhere people wanted to be rather than somewhere people managed. Marcus came for dinner in January, which he does approximately once a month, and he brought his girlfriend Riley, who turned out to have excellent opinions on Italian regional cooking and had strong feelings about the difference between risotto and pilaf, which she defended with impressive conviction. We ate well and talked for 3 hours, and somewhere in the second bottle of wine, Marcus looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who has watched a complicated situation resolve and is genuinely pleased about it, and he said, "You're different, man." I asked him how. He thought about it. "You're not managing anything," he said. "You're just here." I thought about that. "Yeah," I said. "I think that's right." Riley asked Willow something about the renovation project she was working on, and Willow launched into it with the enthusiasm she has when she's talking about something she genuinely loves, and I sat back in my chair with my wine and listened, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside was cold and the people at my table were real, and adequate was not a word that had any purchase in the room. Diana came for a Sunday lunch in February. She brought a tart she'd made herself, imperfectly, the edges slightly uneven, which was itself a kind of evidence that she was trying, and she and Willow set the table and I made the main course, and we ate together in the dining room with winter sunlight on the table, and it was not without its awkwardness, because some things take time and some things take longer, and Diana was a woman who had spent a long time operating in a particular way and new patterns are genuinely difficult. But she passed things without being asked, and she asked me about work with what appeared to be sincere curiosity, and she told a story about Linda's hip that made both Willow and me laugh, and when she left she hugged me at the door, a real hug, not the cheek kiss performance, and said, quietly, near my ear, "Thank you for not giving up on Willow." I said, "She's worth not giving up on." Diana pulled back and looked at me, and something in her face was the expression of a woman who is relieved by something she thought might not be true. Then she walked to her car in the February cold, and I went back inside to where Willow was clearing the table, and she looked up at me when I came in, and I looked back at her, and the look between us had the texture of something newly solid, the kind of solid that doesn't come from never being tested but from having been tested and held. The bedroom set, by the way, is a walnut frame with an ivory-upholstered headboard. Diana sends us a photo of it every few weeks, the natural light on the headboard, a book on the nightstand, a cup of tea catching the afternoon sun. It is genuinely beautiful. I look at those photos and feel nothing complicated at all, which is its own kind of ending. I am a man who tracks numbers. I have always been a man who tracks numbers. What I have learned, in the 14 months since my mother-in-law called to tell me that a 40-minute casserole visit cost $4,200, is that the most important numbers are the ones that don't fit in a spreadsheet. The number of times Willow and I have had a real conversation instead of a managed one. The number of Sundays that have felt like ours. The number of times I've sat at the kitchen table in the early morning, not running anxious calculations, just sitting with my coffee in the house that is mine and hers and no one else's, in the quiet that has a different quality than it used to, not the quiet of something unsaid, but the quiet of something settled, finally and completely, into its right place.